Hey, Alvin. Hi, guys.
Good morning.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. So, thank you very much.
Camera's back here somewhere.
Okay, that's good, but I can't see them, so I want to see them. Anyway, thank you very much for joining us. I have the privilege of moderating this panel. So I have to mention, and so gentlemen, it's gonna be fun. I'm gonna give you hard times, and ladies in the room, please feel free to ask your questions. You have the privilege, you have the priority. So I'm gonna take your questions first. Okay, and so this panel is very interesting, and I have to say, like, when I had a conversation with the panelists before the panel, I asked them, like, can you explain this to me and the audience as if you're explaining to a reasonably intelligent 6 years old? Because I feel like a 6 years old when we talk about metaverse. Like, I'm not saying 12 because I have a nephew and he knows more than me. The other day I asked him, like, can you explain me how this works? I have kids and I'm really worried about their future because my kids will be like, preteens, teenagers in 5 to 10 years time. And it would be an interesting experience. And I consider myself as a tech savvy person, but still I'm having really hard times to understand how this will work. So this panel is aiming to sort it out. And I assume our audience is full of 6 years old kindergartners. And then I ask my panelists to tell us stories. Tell us use cases so that we can better understand, because most of the time it's all about the experiences and stories. So we'll start with a quote from Albert Einstein. If you can't explain it to a 6 years old, you don't understand yourselves. So this quote should guide you in this panel, gentlemen. And I'm going to start with a warm up. And Michael kindly offered us to give the easy warm up, just to get to know you guys, like, and your interest and your knowledge. Like, I assume you are 6 years old, but we'll see, like, whether you are kindergartners or not. And then I will move on to the questions, but we want to have an interactive panel, and ladies have priority, so feel free to ask your questions. Michael, let's start with you.
Great, thank you. So just to get things started, I know we're the last panel before lunch, so I want to make sure we're all engaged and active. So just a quick show of hands, how many of you have looked at your phone in the last hour or two? Yeah, I figured it's pretty much everybody. Just to get an understanding, how many of you have a background or work today in what you'd say is technology and engineering? Okay, and how many would say policy or governance or law? Okay, so we're a mix, half and half. That's really interesting. And from an immersive technology perspective, how many of you have on a regular basis or maybe own or work with a head-mounted display or device? Oh wow, okay, that's a lot more than I was expected. So that's really interesting. So from my perspective, in the interest of telling stories, I don't think about the metaverse as some distant future. I know immersive technology is rapidly evolving, but I look at augmented and assisted technology as something that is almost joined at our hips today. And one example of kind of the intersection of that, I like to think about how we name things and the power of titles and place names, right? So one interesting use case is today on my iPhone, I have all my photos in the cloud, and they're GPS coded, and their AI is analyzing all my photos and bringing up little collections. And it's interesting, I know you're from a background, right, from Turkey. So when I visited Istanbul, now those pictures come up, and oh, you visited a mosque, but a few years ago that was in Zan. So it's kind of retroactive, name place changing. And oh, I was at a Redskins game No. You were at a Warriors game, and so it's almost like rewriting history in real time. So I think, these platforms, although they're not necessarily immersive today, they're already, augmenting and changing how we interact, with our reality today.
Yeah, that's very interesting because we were at a dinner last night, and there was a discussion about Fargo, and Michael has a restaurant recommendation, and he told the lady sitting next to me, and that like, yeah, I know a really great restaurant there, and she was like, actually, it's not that great. It's 3.5 stars. Back in the day, we weren't challenging if someone was giving us a restaurant recommendation. But now you check on Yelp and see 3.5 stars is not good. So anyway, that was a really great start, Michael. And then I'm gonna go to Greece, to Dimitri. Dimitri, since you're a futurist, I want you to paint us a picture of what Metaverse would look like in 5 to 10 years.
Hello from Serbia this time. I'm from Greece, but now I'm speaking at a conference in Serbia. So as regards what the Metaverse will be in 10 years, today we see fragments of what will eventually become the Metaverse. So these fragments, we called it betaverses. We believe that exists a confusion of these betaverses with the actual Metaverse in 8 to 10 years, where individual companies believe that this will be a true Metaverse. That leads in what we describe as meta-washing, where companies claim right now to be part of the Metaverse based on a simple immersive strategy or just a blockchain-based initiative. So in any version of this Metaverse, a user will be able to access one or more home spaces with ways to be connected, private or public digital environments, something that we call now meta spaces or whatever, for purposes like shopping, gaming, entertainment, education, socializing, or even all of the above. Some of them will be commercial, and some meta spaces will require tickets or memberships for visits, while others will rely on in-space purchases like in-game tickets that we have now or freemium models. And there is one scenario that I think is possible. Groups of interested people, some voluntary, some commercial, came together to create a metaverse that we see as a replacement of the World Wide Web. Is very similar to the concept of Web 2 to Web 3. So a new decentralized, interoperable go-to interface to the internet that blends with our physical world with a shared virtual universe using XR technologies. This is a first view of what the future will look like for the Metaverse.
Thank you, Dimitri. That was a very good introduction. And from Serbia, let's go to Taiwan, right? Alvin, you are based in Taiwan, right?
No, so I'm actually normally based in Beijing, but right now I'm actually in Seattle. So it's actually 8 a.m. versus like 4 in the morning or something. So
Sorry about that. Okay, so I have a question for you. So do you think it will be the Chinese tech giants who will build the metaverse? So what's happening in China? Like, because people talk about this Chinese metaverse, so we don't have that much information about it. So can you tell us a little bit about what's happening in China and how much the Chinese tech giants have been investing in metaverse?
Sure. So maybe before we start, I feel like people are thinking that the metaverse is already here, or there are different metaverses. Honestly, first of all, let's define what the metaverse is. And it's not that complicated. It's essentially the next generation or next incarnation of the current internet, but mostly 3D. right? So you're moving from a 2D and video space to a more 3D space. You're moving from a more flat screen consumption to a device, a head-worn device type of consumption, something like this, right? Where you become more immersed, and it's a new medium for you to I guess consume information and to interact with each other. So it's a technology that's going to be essentially replacing most of the interactions that we have in the digital world with this. So almost all your screen time is going to move to something that's head-worn, and that's going to happen over the next 5 to 10 years. So it's not here today, and there is no metaverse today. Even all the companies that are selling metaverse land or metaverse NFTs or whatever, they're not metaverses. They're just all walled gardens of specific individual apps. Or you can call them virtual worlds, or you can call them MMOs, but they're not metaverses, right? A real metaverse is essentially when we have an interoperable network of many worlds that function together. Now, that interoperable world could happen on a national basis, or it could happen on a regional basis, or it could happen on a global basis, right? And I think what you're describing with the China I guess, scenario is that it probably in China will probably be, I think, in my personal opinion, the first place in the world where a full metaverse experience will actually be realized. And the reason for that is because of the high level of interest in the populace to adopt new technology, the very sophisticated network and speeds that are out there today that's already deployed all the 5G, I think more than half of all 5G towers in the world, and probably 60–70% of all 5G users are actually in China. As well as the key thing is really the ability for the government to regulate and enforce standards and interoperability between all of the local players. And when that happens, then you actually have an ability to have that common openness across multiple vendors. So you could go between the various giants that you just mentioned, whether it's Tencent or Xiaomi or Alibaba or Baidu or whoever, right? And have it feel like a continuous journey across all these worlds with a common ID, which they already have across all the websites, with common standards for protocols of communication, and using a common currency, which they already have, which is the ECNY or digital RMB, right? So I think that's actually what is exciting about what China will actually do, is probably become a test bed of being the first cross-vendor open metaverse environment globally, and to see how that functions and how that influences society, and how society reacts to that type of environment. And then I think the rest of the world will learn from those policies, and the ability for the Chinese government to both create policies quickly and to enforce them so that they actually complied quickly across vendors. I think that's something that will be quite interesting to observe over the next few years.
Thank you. So I have a question for Noel. This is your introductory question. Ready? So it's my understanding that it will take years for us to build the metaverse. So we have a long road ahead. And given that our experiences with the existing technologies, what inclusivity in the metaverse will look like? How we can be more intentional about diversity and inclusivity in the metaverse.
I can take this a couple different ways. From a company standpoint, the makers, right? So content developers mostly. You have a fiduciary responsibility to grow profit and to build a solution that is usable, functional, performant, and reliable, so that you can keep your people, your audience, your customers. When in this nascent stage of what may become this utopian metaverse thing, there are different technologies at various stages of maturity. And the idea there is, how do you build a solution to retain the adoption of your customers and still scale out and grow and meet others of other cultures, of other experiences, lived experiences, of other races, various spectrums of accessibility to the devices, and ultimately to the experiences that you have. When you look at it in the frame of that positive sum that comes from intentionally focusing on understanding how the data you're going to use for these experiences are going to be actually realized in those experiences. What data do you really need? And at what point does it hamper the usability of the solution? Say, for example, if I'm building a place tagging or graffiti app, does the maker actually need my name? And maybe they do. Maybe I need to prove who I say I am. But in the realm of inclusivity and diverse experiences, who do you have in the room to make certain decisions? I was just driving up here and I drove past the Holocaust Museum. It looked like there's a dignitary over there, cars all over. To say we've seen Pokemon Go, it's always the AR experience du jour. So I'll use that to expand upon this graffiti idea. The maker of this app creates an experience where you can just go and tag. But there's a culture and a group of people that may hold a certain locale as sacred. And so how do you build in those guardrails in order to prevent virtually defacing the space in augmented reality, or virtually defacing a space when we talk about things like digital twins? That will hamper or it will erode your adoption metrics as an organization. So when I speak to corporations, which is normally my audience, and executives that are thinking, of jumping upon this future where all devices, ideally accessible, will be able to sort of help them create more value with whatever service they're providing, we go through workshops to think about these social technical, those human centered things that they should care about. So that's mostly on the corporation side, and I use that as a pitch because there's always money behind that, which then sort of splinters into, okay, well, you're bought into this vision of expanding into this metaverse or building experiences that are not traditional 2D, and so perhaps you want to start focusing on responsible use of the data that you will use to power some of these experiences. So what does that mean? It means you now have to start understanding legal and regulatory requirements in order to get these tools out. You need to understand the human-centeredness of delivering tools that by nature you're building for people, because it's a head-worn device. There are new design standards that you need to even focus, not new, but design standards that you need to focus more on for safety, how they move around in space, and so on and so forth. All that sort of talks to reaching more people from the perspective of a company.
Okay, that's a really good introduction to my next question about the governance and legal and regulatory requirements, because you mentioned legal and regulatory requirements. So we made the introduction to the metaverse, and we heard the experiences from Europe, from China, and so I want to ask you about the personal data, because in the previously, like Fabio, the previous speaker identified personal data as one of the most pressing issues, protection of personal data in the metaverse. And we know that there are several different regimes governing personal data. So, but there are also internationally accepted shared regime governing intellectual property rights, including the trade secrets. So, for instance, like when I use Uber, like Uber has my data, that's my personal data, but it's also Uber's trade secret, my trip data. So how do we balance that? How do these regimes will intersect in the metaverse? I mean, I know it's a tough question, but I think that's a question that we will face because like we have like regulations and regimes for the protection of personal data and privacy, not in this country, but in other countries. But there are also like intellectual property right protections. So I want to learn, I want to understand how they will intersect. Let's start with you, Michael.
Yeah, so kind of in the spirit of telling stories, I'll talk about my perspective where our work with the government and the Department of Defense has really been focused on the adoption of AR and VR has been really on simulation and training. And as that simulation may involve, as we've seen, simulated war fighting or simulated or even complementing or augmenting, live fire training exercises. If I go back to the presentation from the earlier demonstration where they showed the layer of the technology stack, in the US, I think, we don't have a lot of regulation in that space, but we do have a lot of liabilities, right? We're very litigious. And, from a corporation perspective, everybody's looking to manage those risks and those liabilities. And when you're, delivering, that type of lethality training, or maybe you're actually using devices to, deliver, lethal means, there's certain liabilities. And if you're recently, as recent as last year, I was involved with working one of the larger game engine companies where, they had changed their licensing, legal terms and conditions, where we had to, really renegotiate that with them so that we could continue to leverage those game engine platforms, right? So at each layer of the metaverse tech stack, we're engaged with those companies to make sure that we can continue to leverage those technologies for our defense and in lethality training, because there is that liability and can be real or perceived, right? I mean, I think in the U.S., mass shootings is really front and center today, and we talk about the metaverse, and I think of fun games with what is it, the epic Fortnite, right? So I think there's an extension of how real are these metaverses, and how does that impact the wider policy discussion that's going on in the country. And I think from a corporate perspective, we're always looking to manage those those liabilities. So I think that's a real intersection, and I don't think I have the right answers, but I think at each country and each company, it's becoming a complex issue that's having to be really negotiated on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah, Dimitri, are you still with us?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, so I'm gonna ask you the same question. Given that in Europe you have the GDPR, and you also have strong trade secrets protection, trade secrets directive. And how do you see these two regimes intersect with each other?
Yes, of course. Working with the government, I understand that data stewardship is a key concern, since AR, VR devices require a large amount of information about individuals and their surroundings to deliver an immersive, engaging experience. And as AR, VR becomes common in homes, offices, classrooms, it will be important to protect children's physical and emotional well-being. Often the necessary protection for kids are applied only to products designed for kids, rather than products designed for adults that kids happen to adopt, like an Oculus, for example. And safety and security implications also may include bad actors taking advantage of AR, VR, reality altering capabilities. So privacy considerations that these technologies present make a case for a comprehensive European privacy law that puts the necessary guardrails in place and provides a foundation for companies developing these or other new technologies, or even brands that are building there. It would make sense for a privacy law to be tech agnostic, so that can be impactful also in the future. So for us, the concern of safety and security is with interoperability. Of course, it's a big concern, and accessibility and inclusion must be also foundational in this case. But in the case of data stewardship, we need to work even if we have a general data protection regulation in place.
Thank you. I want to ask Alvin, Alvin, what's your take on this question? But also, I'd like to follow up with another question. Let's hear.
Okay, so let me answer your first question. And recently, actually, China also imposed a GDPR-like, it's a National Data Privacy Act, about I think November, October last year. So that's a little bit behind the European policies, but I think enforced very broadly. And this is actually one of the reasons why the DD IPO was essentially going to be pulled, is because of the data privacy issues. Now, I think in the XR or metaverse use case, this actually becomes much broader, because before it was really just things like phone numbers and emails, or maybe if you're a DD, where did you go? But now with XR devices, you can also look at, well, what did they look at? What was their eye tracking information? What was their biosensor information? Because pretty soon, people are adding EMGs, EEGs, heartbeats, other things to the data gathering. And I think there's also the other issue, the other policy that recently came out, which was the children's gaming policy. So kind of, I guess, adding on what Dimitri's mentioning, I think child protection is going to be something that China is very sensitive to. So now they only allow 3 hours of gaming or social gaming per week for children. So in a way, they're kind of getting ahead of this potential danger of digital addiction or gaming addiction for young people, that's distracting them from schooling or other more healthy pursuits. So I think government actually has a certain responsibility to protect I guess the health of its population, and particularly the young people who have less control and we less self-control. We recently did a addiction tendency study in China with young people, and we found with people of all ages, and we found that young people, teenagers under 15, 16 were the most likely to be addicted to gaming, and particularly to XR type gaming. And also males are also much higher tendency to be addicted tendency compared to females. So if you're a young male, then you probably have a very high tendency, right? So I think there's just certain things that we need to think about. One other thing to add to that is the ability not just to collect data, but to influence the user. I think one of the earlier speakers talked about BCI. I think when BCI actually happens in a broad base, which would be many years away, but before then, we already find that XR is a very good model, a very good medium for transferring information and influence behavior, influencing attitude. So you can collect information, you can also push information. That if you're an advertiser that's a bad actor, kind of what Dimitri mentioned, if there are bad actors out there that want to do things, you could essentially brainwash an audience much more effectively than you could on a 2D screen with video or with other things. So we need to be very careful in terms of how what we allow in terms of content that's being pushed to users. and also what data is collected and how that data is utilized after it's collected, and how much awareness there is from the user's perspective of what data is being collected, even more so than on today's social networks.
Thank you, Alvin. I have a follow-up question. It's a follow-up question on your previous comment about Metaverse, the first Metaverse experience will realize in China. So what do you think the underlying business model would be? Like, we experience like WeChat from China, like everything happens on WeChat, and people tell me like, if you don't
Sure.
have a WeChat in China, you don't exist. So do you think that will be the Chinese metaverse? What kind of like, what will be the business model? Is it like the consumer, it will be consumer oriented or enterprise oriented? Or it will be gaming? So how do you see it?
Yeah, I mean, I think today a lot of I guess Metaverse is kind of linked to social networking today, and social networking is primarily today a advertising-driven business. I think that's actually an unhealthy primary model for the Metaverse, because if you think about the current social network model, it's really more of a medium to send information forward. But the future Metaverse is much more interactive. It's much more analogous to the real world. So I can foresee that pretty much every single existing revenue model in the real world, from goods to services to commerce to interactions to trade, all of that actually can be productive and scalable revenue models in the Metaverse. So we should not be fully dependent on advertising. And advertising as an incentive creates bad behavior, kind of what we're seeing with some of the social networks today, that you really try to grab attention and keep people locked into a screen, which is not a healthy result, particularly when that screen encompasses your entire view and can influence you in a negative way. So I guess if you think about it, I actually want to see labor becoming one of the major revenue sources, because I feel like in the future Metaverse, people will actually be able to work and live there as they do in the real world. And how do most people make their money today is they go to work, right? They go to work in a physical place. But I think in the next 10 years, a lot of people will go to work in this virtual world and interact with other virtual beings that are maybe represented by real or virtual people, and be able to earn their money that way and provide a digital service as they do in the physical world, whether it's white collar services like, let's say, consulting or banking or therapy, or if you're a teacher. I mean, you can definitely do all of these type of activities in the virtual world, without physically being there. And in a lot of ways, I think as AI becomes smarter and smarter, a lot of people are going to be out of job, right? Because if you see that the speed of progress is happening and the ability, I think recently there was a new paper from DeepMind that actually now combines actions in the physical world, perception, be able to generate conversation and recommendations, all in the same engine. I mean, that's starting to get to look like AGI, right? I think we're still a whiles away from that. But when you can then take that same neural network to control a robot arm, a lot of physical labor can be replaced by these automated devices. So in terms of alternative labor models, I really feel like the Metaverse can become a global labor pool or a global labor consumption medium for the world, which can really solve some major headaches that's going to be coming down the road very soon.
Okay, that's interesting. So you think that the Metaverse will become a global labor pool? No, what's your take on that?
I agree with a lot, and I actually want to call back to a comment that Alvin, you mentioned before. You were talking about China's efforts into tempering, or at least getting ahead of addiction through child protection regulations. Another area where other nations, need to or have been looking at is also misinformation and proliferation of misinformation. Now, in an embodied presence, there's a ton of research where immersed, I always say, one sense always displaces the other. And so you trick yourself to feeling that you're somewhere else, and at least in the case of virtual reality, where there's total immersion. There's, I believe, Meta and other organizations like Microsoft, IBM, working on generative AI. You probably have all heard of OpenAI's DALL-E, that kind of stuff. Now, being able to sort of generate an experience or information within an experience is something that is, I wouldn't call standardized, but it will, one, bring in some labor benefits for the entrepreneurial minded among us that want to create that for some sort of revenue. And sort of bridging back into the original question. But in that space, we start wondering things about, the underpinnings of commerce, for example, to enable some of these opportunities for making revenue from either an organization like Nike's doing with a lot of their experiences, Adidas, and the millions of creators around the world. So short answer is I totally agree, and I'm sorry for melding two concepts clumsily together. But one, I believe that if we have I actually don't agree that the metaverse is the next generation of the internet. I just believe it is an additive experience, but that's for another day. And in new additive experiences, there will be a need for economic impact. These are areas that governments are going to worry about. Now, the technical pieces of that, how to protect one's identity, how to facilitate privately facilitate some of these transactions. There's some academic research there, like zero knowledge proofs that are already more on the blockchain technology, not NFTs, but just more on the blockchain technologies to keep private a lot of some of the identity related things that go with, creating and consuming the metaverse.
Okay, I have a long list of questions, but I see the clock there, and I know that we have questions from the audience. There are a few questions online, but I promise that I'm going to give the priority to the ladies in the room. So I'm asking you, ladies, do you have questions for our man? Please.
You appreciate the priority list here. I have a question for Alvin, and again, I'll just reference I'll preface my question with our research, and I think what we've seen was China regulation on tech is that actually they're not completely dissimilar to some of the mechanisms that we see in the EU, and quite innovative also if you look at the AI in the legislation. However, it is a big however, there are clear divergences when it comes to the role of government, and so how it may be enforced in a way that I guess in Western or sort of in the US and EU will consider that to be very intrusive. And therefore my question is, and Alvin, I was really struck by what you say in terms of addiction and limiting to 3 hours the amount of time that young kids could play online. So my question is to how does the government plan to enforce that?
So let me just make sure I heard the question correctly. So you're just saying that a lot of the policies may be similar to the EU, but the enforcement is different. Yeah. So in terms of the gaming regulation, essentially it's 3 hours per person under 18 per week. and it's only for social gaming or multi-user gaming. So if you want to go online to research a paper or whatever, you can go online as long as you want. But I think there are certain accounts. Essentially, what they've done is that they've worked with all of the major multi-user gaming companies, and they track what are the ages of the users, and people who are under 18 will be flagged, and then they will track their time on those specific apps, which I think it's a healthy thing. I mean, it's not necessarily a great thing for the financials of some of these gaming companies. I think recently Tencent announced that they essentially had a 0.01% increase in revenue in the last year, which they're already a very big company, so it's not like they're losing money, but they're not growing like they used to with the 30-40% per year type of growth. So it's impacting their revenues, but if it's bring more time for youth to spend in more healthy ways, I'm not necessarily against that.
Thank you, Alvin. Are there any questions from? There's another lady there.
So I have a question that follows up on that. Right after China announced new rules around the amount of time people could game, a lot of gaming companies pulled out of China. And I mean, you did point out that Tencent, their profitability has dropped, and I can speak for my own company. We pulled out of China on the gaming side. And when you look at the kind of companies that are investing in these future metaverses, if you will, a lot of them are gaming companies. So from your perspective, what does that mean from an innovation perspective and China's ability to compete in this space?
I honestly, I feel like gaming should not be the basis of the future metaverse. Even if you watch Ready Player One, it feels like it's all about gaming. But honestly, I feel like the metaverse will be essentially an alternative world where people will inhabit and live their lives as they do in the physical world, in terms of working, learning, playing, entertaining, socializing. Right, so it's encompassing all aspects of your lives. Now, some people may choose to spend more or less time there, but gaming should not be the only thing that's going on. In fact, Tencent recently announced that they're forming a specific, metaverse business unit. So they're definitely putting significant investment in there. If you look at TikTok or ByteDance, who owns TikTok, they've recently bought Pico and have also created a kind of VR metaverse business unit. So the amount of innovation that's actually going to happen in China is probably in the metaverse space, and particularly in the software and use case space, is probably going to be as much, if not more so, than what's happening in the West. I think I think the first one or 2 months of Meta changing their name, China had, I think, like 30,000 companies that had the word metaverse in their name registered as new companies. If you look at the current Google trends in terms of the metaverse term, what country is the most popular in terms of using that term? It's actually China. So I feel like China is actually going to be I guess an early adopter. I don't know if you're saying an innovation leader, but at least an early adopter of this technology. There's definitely a lot of innovation that's happening in the West, and things that will work here will pass very quickly to China, and there will be unique things that will be created in China because if they're the first to implement a vast cross-population metaverse environment, you're going to have the first fully interoperable cross-vendor billion-person market, and you're going to learn a lot from there. And there's going to be a lot of innovation that happens because there are that many people. This is why, if you look at the mobile internet or mobile payment market, why did it flourish in China first? Is because they were the first place where there were billion users in mobile doing all these things and scanning QR codes and doing the WeChat the type of things that we're talking about, doing mobile commerce before anywhere else in the world. Is because of the scale of the user base, and that scale of users creates automatic innovation because it's a great testing bed for different business concepts and different use cases.
Thank you, Alvin. I have a few questions from the online audience, and I like to ask those questions before coming back to the room. So I think this question is for you, Dimitris, since you are from Greece, and I think you will be able to explain us better. Like, can you describe the hospitality and tourism in the metaverse?
Tell me, please repeat the question again.
Yeah, can you describe hospitality and tourism in the metaverse?
Yes, of course. I can describe it because it's, as a government, is a concern, and as a government that has more than 20% of the GDP in the hospitality industry is a bigger even concern. How we see hospitality. We see metaverse and extended reality as an actual demo to the physical space. So now and for the next 10 years, we have the technologies in place to create immersive, very intuitive experiences of something that you can experience as a physical human being. So our view in how we can use the metaverse and how we can use the XR technologies in the hospitality industry is to create short experiences and demoing the actual unique experience that you can live when you're visiting a beach or when you're visiting a cultural space, because also the cultural space is big in terms of how you create the demand to actual visit something when you already saw it on a VR headset or even a more immersive experience.
Thank you. Anyone wants to chime in on this question?
I was just
Yeah,
gonna,
in terms of tourism, I also feel like it's going to change. It's going to enable a lot of equity in the world, because one of the things that separates the rich and the poor is the ability to travel. And in virtual space, essentially anybody has access to a headset can do that traveling and create that cross-cultural and cross-border type of understanding that's missing in a lot of the world. A lot of the conflict that happens in the world is because people don't understand each other, and they've never been to this other place, and they create this invisible hate for something that they don't understand. So if we can allow people to travel more virtually and meet people live, as well as understand the culture and the surroundings and environments of different places around the world, which is actually can be done very cheaply. It creates a first, equality between the rich and the poor more, and it also hopefully will reduce conflict in societal on a broader basis. And devices are coming down in prices. I mean, a few $100s, I think most people can afford that. It's a lot cheaper than a plane ticket.
Michael.
yeah, so just going back to the tourism thing, I think, augmented reality, I think could really add a new level of aspect, right? Where you're using real tours, tour guides and moving to more, virtual tour guides when you're physically at a location. But I think all of these technologies have the opportunity, to disrupt and cause social change. But I think they also have the opportunity to reinforce, existing social structures and disparities and social economic structures that are in place. So again, I think that to be determined, right, how these technologies are used.
I love, really quick, I love Dimitrius's sort of expanding upon this with the concept of the demo to sort of a demo to reality, right? And it made me immediately think of EdTech. I don't know the data, I don't have the data in front of me right now, but I imagine the population of international students, of people wanting to sort of learn in different areas being quite significant, being quite large at the, historically, and probably growing ever since this pandemic has sort of gone into place. And so I immediately thought of sort of college tours and sort of setting the stage and sort of bringing in some of these artifacts that you'd probably see if you could afford to travel to 5,000 miles away from where you presently are, becomes possible. And I'm cheating here because it's actually a thing that happens already. So that actually sort of brings me full circle to where I started out with the diversity and inclusion thing and building across different types of cultures, baking in accessibility by design and privacy by design in a way that sort of satisfied different regulations around the world as well. Just looking at that singular example of, college tours, either virtually or augmented.
So we can say that then, we can learn how to dance Turkey before going to Greece.
That's
right, Dimitri?
Exactly, and you are all invited, of course.
Okay, I have another online audience question, which is also interesting because that really links to your comment, privacy by design, equality, and diversity. So the question is, and this is for all the panelists, how can the public interest in the metaverse be defined? It's a tough question, so I'm not picking anyone, but who wants to go first? Define the public interest in the metaverse.
Well, I can go. I can take a stab at this,
Yeah.
and I'd love to hear the perspectives. It's a very broad general question, so I have the liberty of going any direction I want.
It's from the audience, not my question.
Yeah,
but it's a really great question.
There's a push and pull. I talked about, businesses, big data and the value that brings to companies. So there's an interest in sort of hoarding data that is shed by consumers or users of that data, of said data. In contrast to that, there within the last 10 years, or if not longer, with the proliferation of data or the additional uses of big data for AI and other uses, there's been a lot of awareness of the breaches that come along with that. If there's a breach, that means one or more of my name, email, matched with something also available in the market can actually. So that's contrasting with hoarding that data because now there's more awareness that if there's a breach, my data could be, that could bring harm to me in some way, financially or physically or whatever. Say, for example, I'm in a country that may be looking for me or something like that because of my sexual identity or whatever, political affiliation, that kind of stuff. And so that tug and pull brings regulations, right, for people. Those opposing forces now mean there's a there's increased attention to policies, whether it's neutral in its adoption for us to innovate in this, for companies to innovate in the space, and then later go in to sort of target certain areas that affect immersive experiences. So to the question, public interest in as far as this sort of goes against what companies want to do, but they will be forced by regulatory bodies, compliance, and ultimately would want to reduce their risk to what is GDPR? GDPR is like 5% of your annual revenue, or 20%, or whichever comes first. So as long as the regulations have teeth, at least for this context, I'm hopeful.
Dimitri or Alvin, do you want to chime in?
Yes, of course.
I didn't fully understand the question, actually.
Oh, we sorry about that. We were talking about the public interest and how can the public interest in the metaverse be defined?
How can it be implied, you said?
Defined.
Defined. Okay. Go ahead, Dimitri.
Okay, thank you very much, Alvin. For us, the metaverse represents a great future opportunity because it will represent, for example, we can create employment, we can impact education, we can deliver healthcare, we can even plan urban spaces. Of course, it will be the next major labor organizing platform. So there are new product, services, payment processing, identity verification, hiring, content generation, and security. So there is a huge interest from the government's perspective, but there is also a lot of questions. So how will governments deal with the sale of a national monument using an NFT when both the buyer and the seller are not its nationals? Or how will the homicide of a digital twin of a person in the metaverse be treated? And other questions. So how will governments ensure regulatory compliance and tax reporting for the companies operating only in the metaverse? There are a lot of questions, and of course, a lot of future challenges. I think that we are here to see and build all the policies required in order to have an actual working, interoperable, open, decentralized metaverse.
Thank you. I saw a few hands up, so I'd like to take more questions or more ladies. Like, let's start with Susan. We are taking over this panel. Great.
I'd like this question to be directed at Nova, but whoever wants to answer it can. So there's a correlation, right, between the design of data sets and designing data sets. Thank you. And so we've seen a lot of mistakes with the design of AI, and a lack of ability as a result of that to design an inclusive system. I fear that the metaverse could be that on steroids.
Your microphone.
Yeah, okay, let me see what I get. So there's a correlation, right, between who is designing data sets and for training data, right, which led us to this thing called trustworthy AI. An attempt to reconcile that problem, right? And to use that strategy to try to achieve inclusiveness. But I think that the metaverse could put that on steroids. It's still very male dominated. It's obviously in China very ethnically diverse, but not so much racially diverse. So how do we learn from what happened with the design of AI, which has proven itself to be problematic? How do we improve upon that for immersive technology? I realize that question is very general, but I'm curious.
No, but before you start, I think we only have 5 minutes, and let's
No,
like.
well, we're going to extend it by 5 minutes.
Okay, that's
Yes.
good then. Then go ahead, like, because I want to take the other questions from the audience. So.
And I'll try to be as succinct as I possibly can, because this could go, again, in many directions. But the net here is all models are wrong, some are useful. I don't know who to attribute that to. When we talk about making sure that models, AI models for use for metaverse or general purpose are, unbiased in how they're generated, that are fair, we run into a lot of issues because there's no one definition of fairness to a specific group, just not in case law, not even in technology, right? It's how Allspace VR defines fairness for a specific use case, such as how to identify a boundary around a person if they don't want to interact with another person, may differ from a telehealth or telemedicine use case in their definition of fairness. So it makes it very, very difficult. However, luckily, smarter people than I have come up with fairness metrics that about 30 or so right now, I believe, as of a year ago when IBM sort of released their FairLearn. And so algorithm. So the long way to say, or just to sum this up, is spending more time on data-centric AI, being more responsible in the use of the data and the models or responsible use of AI solutions, meaning retraining based on how you see the model performing out in the world. I'll close with an actual example in the spirit of storytelling, which I sort of talked about the natural language applications of or conversational AI application within this immersive or spatial experience or different spatial experiences. And language is very nuanced, as we can imagine, even within the US. How do you deal with sarcasm? Who is the arbiter of fair when it comes to how things are said? So content moderation becomes extremely difficult to do, but it all comes down to understanding the data that you want to use and pairing that to any fairness metrics, or at least your understanding of what it would mean to get this thing out without harming people. And then and only then moving into your model building and testing and being human-centric and how you get that out into the world. And of course, monitoring that and understanding how that's being used in an open way.
Okay, I think Dimitri has.
Actually, can I add one point to that? So I agree with actually everything you just said. One thing I do want to give an example of what China is actually doing a little bit differently is that they recently enacted a AI protection law that allows the user to select when they want to turn off algorithms. So rather than being forced by various biased or unbiased algorithms to feed them information, they can go into their social feed and networks and say, I want to have a pure raw feed without any algorithm involvement. And it's an option for the user. I think that actually is quite innovative in terms of giving people a choice.
Thank you, Alvin. I think Dimitri has to leave, so let's say the final goodbye to Dimitri. But Dimitri, do you want
Thank you very much for the invitation.
concluding remarks before you leave? Just about the metaverse and the future and all the discussion we had. Like, do you have like concluding remarks for us, or just want to run your keynote?
Just a quick note that a true metaverse is more of a vision than a concrete reality right now. So there is still time to create a metaverse that will not mirror the flaws of the real world, but create a better one. So thank you very much for the invitation. I really enjoyed the panel. I need to deliver my keynote in the conference here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dimitri. Good luck with the keynote. Okay, coming back to the room, and I saw the hands up, and there we have. Let's collect some questions, and then we can answer them. Okay, let's start. Adam, do we also have online questions that you want to share?
No, we won't have time for that.
Okay, let's do the.
Only 5 minutes.
Okay.
So I think if we have 6-year-olds who are getting this explanation, we have 2, and one of them has a pretty clear idea of what the metaverse is going to look like, and that would be the Chinese 6-year-old in the room. So it's going to be top-down government protocols that ensure interoperability, third-party access. There's going to be a digitally native currency, also government-issued central bank digital currency. But I think the non-Chinese 6-year-old is still saying, okay, well, is it going to be a private cryptocurrency that I'm using? Is it going to be game-centered? And it sounds like we're still in very much a siloed universe. So I'd love to hear if the non-Chinese version is also a CBDC, if it's also that centralized sort of enforced protocols to ensure interoperability, or if there's another sort of vision that's being put forward that's maybe becoming dominant elsewhere. Thank you.
Okay, this is a question for you. But while you are thinking, let's take more questions from the audience. There is one there, and then there's another one here.
I asked this question in the spirit of the 6-year kindergartner who knows very little. 2 questions, one on scale. So, I'm a journalist from South Asia, where low-cost mobile sets and low-cost data revolutionized and pioneered, led to the digital revolution over the last 20 years. Are we assuming that what you're suggesting is scalable almost at the same level, because this has an additional infrastructural requirement, which is the headset. And are we assuming that costs are going to diminish dramatically? And are we assuming that it's going to be as easy for people to be as mobile with these sets? So this may be a somewhat naive question, but a lot of these assumptions seem to be based on. The second is that as technology is getting more global, politics is getting more nationalistic, and sovereignty is back. So in a context where data flows, crossbait and data localization is already such an issue of bilateral contestation, are we going to see, and I'm returning to the theme of the panel here, the fragmentation of the metaverse, where each jurisdiction and big markets, for instance, will be very reluctant to share body data with tech companies based in Silicon Valley. I mean, there has already been a lot of negative kind of backlash to that kind of data monopolization, and there is going to be resistance, at least in the developing world, as I see it.
Okay, and the last but not the least
Probably
question.
all will have that.
Yeah, the last question.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I live in the real world for the moment, and I have observed the phenomenon of fake news. And what you consider fake news and what I consider fake news might not be the same thing. But we've not yet really found a way to deal with distinguishing between the fake and the real news. Now we're entering into a metaverse which blends, is somewhere in between fact and fiction. And we're talking about the possibility of altering the signals. So we can have tourism to real places, but we can have tourism to fake places, imaginary places. And we can have tourism to places that purport to be real but have been modified. And I see the problems that we have distinguishing the fake from the real news being multiplied in this metaverse. But I also see that there might be ways of dealing with it in the metaverse that don't apply to the real world. So I don't know if people have started thinking in those terms, but I think we've had a lot of experience in the real world of trying to manage fake news that has not been particularly successful. And I just throw that out for the hope we can learn from that experience about mistakes. We don't want to make the same mistakes in the metaverse that we have made in the real world.
Okay, gentlemen, you had four questions, and we are out of time, so I'll give you 1 minute each as a moderator to wrap up.
Okay, thank you. So just speaking to the first question there, I think we have to, can't assume that we live outside of history. And I think looking back at, what has progressed with our mobile phones is probably my assumption is what the future will hold. I think we'll probably have a duopoly of walled gardens in metaverses, and I think gaming will be the operating system of the metaverses. I mean, 5 years ago, the 60% of the Apple's App Store revenue was Candy Crush purchases. So, I mean, that blew my mind, right? So I think the amount of money that people are willing to spend on virtual things that have no real world value is very interesting. And I think we're seeing that with NFTs and art and all different types of things. But to the other question about fake news, I think going back when I was growing up in the supermarket, used to have the Sun and the magazines about, President Clinton is dating an alien, right? And nobody, it was entertainment value. Nobody believed that was true. Suddenly, if it's on Facebook, people think that that's true, and I don't know how to, it's a bigger problem. I don't think we're going to solve it. That's right. So with that, I'll hand it off.
Okay, let's go to Alan, and then you had the final question. Okay, Alan.
Yeah, so I think on the question of West versus China, I think that the West will be in a wall garden scenario for probably much longer than China, but I think ultimately we will actually get to a fairly common pseudo interoperable metaverse. And there will be pockets of it that will still be regionally locked in. It'll be very, very much what we have today with the internet, right? I would say 95% of the internet is actually fairly open, but there'll be parts of it that certain regions have only have access to. And the natural forces of the network effect of having more users, having more openness will force that to happen. So it's just a matter of time. And in terms of whether it's going to be CBDC or crypto, I actually believe that longer term CBDCs are going to win out. Because governments are going to not, I think China kind of got ahead of it because they banned crypto early and created the CBDC. But I think pretty much every country in the world right now is looking at CBDC. And the fact that you lose taxability, you lose the ability to control your own financial system. I think very few countries longer term will realize that's a good thing for them. There may be some intermediate periods where both will coexist, and there may be some coins that will still be successful. But I'm actually more bullish on the CBDC side. But although I don't think every country needs its own CBDC. In terms of the cost of devices, I actually don't think that's going to be as big of an issue. I mean, we have devices now that are $200-300, which are as cheap or cheaper than a lot of phones out there today. And the prices are only going to come down over time. So accessibility is not going to be an issue. Fake news, I think fake news is only the beginning because the ability to influence the mind in XR and in the metaverse will be much greater than today's social. So that's why I said earlier that there needs to be more regulation in place and more foresight in terms of how to prevent bad actors from improperly influencing the minds of the participants and viewers on the metaverse. So something that the government definitely needs to look into early.
No, you have the last one.
Thank you, and I'll be quick. I'll end it with a controversial point. I actually think walled gardens are necessary, at least with nascent technology before they proliferate and become ubiquitous. That's just me. I think it happens with any industry, within any industry, for network effects to work, for content, to identify the right content that lands with the right audience. For example, think AOL and CompuServe and those other types of networks. Over time, we figured out all the standards, we figured out all the best practices, design patterns, those kind of things in order to make things better. And I would say it's way better today, the web is, than it used to be when in terms of technology, like Flash-based websites versus WC3 compliant sites today. So I'll end with that and say, to me, it all comes down to how you define metaverse, whether, and the concerns that you have. I would just say to you is the metaverse is actually not a thing. So it will be a point in time once we've figured out all this stuff with policy, technology, and user needs.
Thank you. That was a really great conclusion, and I'll leave it there. Thank you very much. It's time for lunch now.